So let's turn a negative into a positive by saying, hey guys, we've recognized the potential impacts that the climate emergency is going to have on our place, our state, our town. And here, having done an audit, and I'll return to this later in our conversation, having done an audit of the potential impacts, we now know the kind of things we need to do.
Welcome to Place Brand Leaders, the interview podcast of the Place Brand Observer. I'm Florian Kaefer, and in this podcast I introduce you to some of the world's leading place reputation gurus and community champions. I'm interested in how they tick, what inspires them, and how they help their city, region or country attract visitors, investors or talent. We also discuss some of the topics which are the most urgent and most relevant for place branders and makers right now, be it sustainability, reputation management, or how to measure success. For this third episode, I sat down with Malcolm Allan to discuss a white paper on the climate emergency and its implications for place branding. We recently published the white paper on placebrandobserver.com. Malcolm is the president of Bloom Consulting, which he joined in 2018 when he merged his own consultancy with it. He has qualifications in town planning and civic design and development economics. Malcolm has worked in the UK for both central and local governments and as a private consultant all around the world. He founded Place Brands with Simon Anholt back in 2002, which was the first dedicated place brand agency in Europe back then. I hope you enjoy our conversation as much as I did, and of course I would love to hear your feedback. So Malcolm, at the Place Brand Observer, we recently published a white paper on the climate emergency and its implications for place branding. Before we take a closer look at the advice shared in the white paper, and knowing that the climate emergency is something you care strongly about as a place brander, let me ask you, was there a specific moment that made you realize just how important the topic would become for the attractiveness and competitiveness of places?
Yes, it was back in November of last year, 2019, at the annual City Nation Place Global Conference in London, when I was listening to a session about how brands are valued, and a lot of the content was about the really good things that brands can do for places. And it just struck me that I hadn't heard anyone in the conference or read anything about their presentations that was actually dealing with the impact of the climate emergency, nor anything about taking action to mitigate the impacts of the climate emergency in order to, if you like, improve the resilience of the place and improve the sustainability of the actions it was taking. And that just suddenly struck me. It's almost like a Damascene moment. That was an epiphany that this really needed to be debated, because what I was seeing, and particularly informed by the work that my consultancy Bloom had been doing in Costa Rica, probably one of the most climate-aware nations and countries in the world, that we really had to be debating this as place branders, and that it was time to get that debate underway, and it was time to understand what the role of place branding could actually be in this process of actually addressing and mitigating the climate change.
In your experience, Malcolm, is the climate emergency getting the attention it deserves amongst city and country branding teams? And if not, what might be holding them back?
Well, if I actually look at what is being said about it in the discourse amongst place brand strategists or place brand marketeers, or even just simply tourism marketers, etc., I think that there is more thought being given to it now as a result of COVID-19 than there was before. So it certainly in the period between November and November of 2019 and March of 2020, I wasn't really seeing any debate taking place about this. Since then, because many observers and commentators are calling for a green recovery for economies to come out of COVID, for places to become more resilient in taking action to mitigate the effects of, say, a continuance of the disease, of the virus. There's also been debate around about the whole issue of there being a symbiosis, a connection between taking action on COVID and actually dealing with the climate emergency. People saying, look, we've seen the epic scale of government responses, not always well thought through, I know, but significant levels of public resources are going into dealing with COVID. Why aren't we devoting those kind of scale of resources to dealing with the climate emergency? Because the climate emergency, in effect, has much greater power to devastate our lives, our environment, the way the world works than COVID. There's potentially and hopefully a medical response to COVID, but the response to climate emergency is much more complicated and much greater. And I think that's a good sign. However, in kind of preparation for the podcast, I've been looking at the stated aims and objectives of place brand strategies and what's happening in the forums on LinkedIn, the Sustainable Leaders Program, etc. And there's still very little debate about it. And I just wonder whether that's truly a reflection of lack of interest or lack of knowledge, or simply that people have not thought through, people in the field of place branding have not thought through, hey, we've got a potential role to play here, both in alerting people to the potential impact of the climate change emergency and to begin to think about the actions to be taken to mitigate those impacts by making places more resilient.
I remember in the white paper there's a section actually quoting you about the reasons which might be holding place branding teams back, as well as city and country leaders in general. What is holding us back?
I think there potentially are a number of reasons. Let's start with the negative first of all. I've recently been in Australia working with colleagues on the nation brand of Australia, and someone I know in Perth said to me, look, do you really think that politicians want to be saying to their publics and to the world at large, hey, we are going to be really badly affected by the climate emergency. Hey, this is not going to be a safe place to invest or to come to work or to stay in. And while I can understand that, that's almost like an abandonment of a responsibility as far as I'm concerned. And I think that what places and their politicians and decision makers, and indeed place branders, should be recognizing is that this is not going to go away. And the longer we take to take action on it, the more harsh are the impacts going to be. So let's turn a negative into a positive by saying, hey guys, we've recognized the potential impacts that the climate emergency is going to have on our place, our state, our town. And here, having done an audit, and I'll return to this later in our conversation, having done an audit of the potential impacts, we now know the kind of things we need to do. We now know we need to increase investment in mitigation in order that we can retain a good semblance of the quality of life that we currently have, in order that our tourism attractions can continue to operate. We need to take action not just to make them safer, but we need to be looking at the criteria for investments in future businesses, in manufacturing plants, in heating systems for public places. We now need to actually be demonstrating we're taking this seriously and taking those investments. In the same way that places are now being criticized for not having effective remedies for COVID, they should be waking up to the fact that they need to show they have effective remedies for mitigating the impact of the climate emergency. So that's one area. I think also there's a role for place brand strategists because it's a very holistic, quite wide field of study and action. We're looking at everything that, represents the brand and values, the actions, the beliefs of a place. So I do think there's a role for brand strategists to be saying, guys, here is the imperative. We've really got to understand not just the global implications of what's happening in climate change, but look at those kinds of things. Just look at the last 3 months of what's happened in the United States. The fires, again, another season of fires in California, now in Oregon, now in Portland. Look at the way of life that's being devastated. Look at entire towns that are being wiped out. Do we have the skills and knowledge to be mitigating those kind of things? My time in Australia demonstrated to me that they are really beginning to understand that the bushfires are almost an annual event now, and they're getting bigger in scale. So they're looking at mitigation on a significantly greater scale than ever before, and that's part of what the nation brand is about. It might not reflect central government policy to the extent that people in Australia might like or I would like.
In our Place Brand Observer panel conversation, which led to the white paper later on, you also mentioned that your boss can be a problem, like if you're a place brander and if your political leader or whoever pays you or is in charge of the program, if he or she is a climate change denier, unwilling to invest in measures to address the climate crisis, then of course your hands are tied as well, right?
Yes, I think that has happened. The extent to which it will continue to happen, I think, will be based on the extent to which, let me be blunt and simple-minded about it. Simply put, we have to be brave and put these issues on the table. We have to point out or call out when people are denying that. And yes, it can be very difficult for people. I've been in government, I've been in local government, and I'm now a consultant and have been a consultant for a long time. And if I state my beliefs on this, the worst that can happen to me is I might not get hired again or called out by the deniers, whereas someone who might be a chief environmental health officer or a chief architect in local government or an energy supply person, it can be quite difficult for them. I do think, however, that we can marshal press, we can marshal professional organizations, and we can marshal public opinion in the place to actually have those debates. And what I find quite interesting is that the UK experiment with citizens' assemblies dating from 2012 has brought people of different persuasions, deniers, enthusiasts, etc., together to begin to actually debate these kind of things. And I think, as professionals in the field, we can take some confidence from that. And we need to get involved in those kind of assemblies. We need to take the fight to them. Just standing back and saying, no, this is not part of my responsibility, I think is an act of cowardice.
Yes, absolutely. And I understand it when people fear for their jobs or future contracts. But still, I mean, in the long term, it hurts the communities and the competitiveness of those cities, regions, or countries, which you're supposed to help as a place brander. But let's go back to the white paper now and to the section with the key takeaways, in which we summarize main bits of advice for place branders on how to deal with the climate emergency. Are there any among those which you found especially useful or relevant for practitioners?
I found them all relevant for practitioners, but let me start with one of the first ones where in the white paper there are people who are advocating not building their brand positioning on climate change. And I would take significant issue with that. However, what I'm meaning by that is my alternative would be that people have to recognize they should be protecting their brand positioning by taking action to mitigate the effects of the climate emergency through increasing the resilience and sustainability of place and its offers. And there's a takeaway about the importance of resilience. And let me be clear that I understand resilience to be to strengthen the ability of the place and what it offers to withstand known or potential shocks that might disrupt it as a place to live and how it operates, or might affect its attractions and its assets. In the climate of the debate on climate change, I think it behoves places to begin to actually audit, from the massive scale of knowledge we have before us, the potential effects of that. So, for example, the significant level of flooding that happened in the UK in the last winter, and flooding in floodplains where large amounts of housing had been built. The mitigation should include, for example, not allowing any more housing to be built in floodplains, because the effect is that the people who bought those houses, knowing full well they were in a floodplain, can no longer get insurance on them, and therefore they can't sell them, and therefore they have a depressed negative value asset. And in the same way, I've seen examples in Australia of townships recognizing what they have to do to minimize the impact and ameliorate the potential impact of further bushfires. So I think that's important, and that's about the piece of advice about backing your brand promise with actions. And research that Bloom's undertaken on place branding strategy over the last 5 or 6 years shows that brand strategies that don't have action plans that are built into the process of taking them forward as part of implementation, that haven't thought about what's the funding for taking this action, or what are the policies we need to put in place, tend not to work, tend not to have an impact. And I think your point, the piece of advice about changing the behavior of audiences, is very important. I think, first of all, we've got to change the behavior and belief of the audience that are the practitioners of place branding and the managers of place branding, including the politicians elected who fund and create the teams that do this work. But ultimately, it has to be about changing the behaviors of those who pollute. And we all pollute as human beings. We drive cars, we take flights, we burn fossil fuels. And I'm beginning to see, places in the UK, cities like Manchester, Leicester, Coventry, for example, cities on the continent like Copenhagen and Denmark, countries like Costa Rica, are putting in place policies that basically say, well, you're not going to get planning permission for this, that, or the other unless you can show an alternative to fossil fuel consumption, unless you can show you will make a contribution to reducing noxious emissions. And I think it's about understanding the scope for action that can actually be undertaken, not throwing your hands up in horror and saying it's all too complex. So you have to start somewhere. And I'd add a key takeaway that for me, a starting point is to say, okay, we know it's a big issue, but what we don't know is the scale that will affect our place, our locality. Let's look at the kinds of impacts that might happen in our city, our place, and look at what's the potential scale and look at what might be the mitigating action. And I've reached a conclusion that the cost of mitigating action will be significantly less than the cost of taking no action. In the same way that the cost of mitigating COVID, which is significant, the economic impacts, the health impacts. But what if we'd taken no action at all? The numbers of people who would have died would be significantly more. The number of businesses denied staff would be significantly more. The number of businesses not being able to operate would be significantly more. So taking action might initially be quite expensive. But unlike COVID, this is the long-term future of place, the long-term future of the planet. To not take action now, to not take the right action at the right time, I think would be a serious abrogation of our responsibilities to the places that we live in.
And reflecting on your own consulting practice, where do you see the limitations in terms of what economic developers, destination managers, marketers, and other place branding professionals can realistically achieve in terms of doing something about the climate emergency?
Um, when I was giving thought to this, I came to the conclusion that there's and what I hear is there's often what I would call a failure of imagination, a failure of imagining how we might begin to organize ourselves to take action. It all seems to be so big, so complex, so multi-layered, so multi-dimensional, which is why I advocate that a starting point is to do an audit of the kinds of impacts you think the climate emergency might have in your face. I think there's also the fear factor, which we touched upon earlier, that admitting to the fear that your place might be devastated is not a politically desirable or attractive admission to make. But I think we've got to go through that failure of imagination, address that area of fear, to begin to create a desire to take action, to ameliorate this, to limit it. And I think we need to get organized. One of the big issues, I think, that the example of Costa Rica and putting together a nation brand strategy over the last 5 years, we were there working with them, was the recognition that government too often works in silos, works apart from itself. Ministers don't collaborate. And the Prime Minister, the new president of the country, she decided, her name is Claudia Dobles Camarago, she decided the government had to act as one, had to address a number of dimensions as one. And I think that one of the obstacles to be overcome, it's a bit like removing King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table from just responding one by one separately to actually working together. Government departments at the national, federal, state, local level have to recognize that they're going to have to combine their imaginations, their energies, their desires, the skills, their budgets, their competencies to address this, and begin to prioritize where they're going to take action. Rather than throwing their hands up in horror, wondering where to start, they've actually got to, put the foot in the water.
I think it's clear that at the government level they have to take action. But again, where does it leave the place branding professionals? So advisors like yourself who are brought in usually with the mandate to increase visitor numbers or to attract investors or talent, what can they do? I
think we have to be honest as consultants, and I think there's some of the debate taking place amongst place branding professionals dealing with tourism and tourism marketing who have recognized that they need to, the future of their offer, the future economic health of their offer has to be in the context of being able to show and demonstrate that it's a safe place to visit. It's a safe offer. And increasingly, it is an offer that has to be managed in such a way that the return of tourists, the return of interest in the place doesn't put the long-term future of the assets of the place, the environment, the heritage, the history, the culture at risk. I think responding to COVID has illustrated for many in the tourism sector that better management is required and that new proposals for the improvement or the development or increased resilience of the tourism offer need to be better managed and in such a way that it doesn't affect or increase the risks of health problems, and that could be from protecting from COVID through to clean air, reducing emissions and pollution. So that for me is a sign of positiveness. I think we need a similar kind of approach for the attraction of inward investment. I think we need a similar approach for improvement in the environment. I would look at the examples of the Mayor of London and some other cities around the world, recognizing that whilst you need policies to limit the impact of new investment in manufacturing processes on the environment, you also need to increase the resilience of the stock of urban buildings and their heat systems. Major investments are needed to minimize and remove the health hazards therein. And I think government, we have a responsibility to demonstrate to governments that, yes, we do want to protect the environment. Yes, we do want to protect sectors. But actually, we've got to demonstrate to sectors and give them economic assistance to actually remove the problems they are now causing.
A big thank you to our subscribers and partners for trusting the Place Brand Observer and for making this podcast possible. You want to know more about nation brand evaluation, country reputation, or how to attract talent and investors to your city? Visit the business profiles of brand finance, future place leadership, and other specialists in our directory, all on placebrandobserver.com. Do you think that consultancies in their pitches for place branding projects, mentioning things like this or adhering to a code of ethics of some sort, would they have a competitive advantage for winning projects, or is it still very much budget focused, just from your own experience with Bloom?
Budgets are always a limiting factor. What the budget is spent on is often prioritized by the interests and policies of the politicians. My own view is very simple in this respect. I'm in a business, but I think it has to be a business with ethics. I think we have to abide by a code of values. I don't think, the place branding has come up in the last 20 years. When I look around local government, I see professionals who are members of institutes of surveyors, engineers, architects, landscape architects, heating engineers, professional bodies that have been institutionalized for 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, in some cases 100 more years, who have professional codes of practice and standards. Place branding, if I might be a little imaginative, say, is still in the Wild West of its formation. There are no codes of practice. There are no, institutions governing place branding either worldwide. The nearest that comes to it are national bodies on marketing who promote good behavior, good standards of practice. These don't exist, as far as I know, amongst the global place branding community. And I think the climate emergency behoves us to explore what are good standards, what are the values that we should practice by, and what is it we should be telling by way of truth about the climate emergency, truth to power. I, as a practitioner, will always debate this with politicians, but I recognize in many places we work or have worked that they're just not mature enough about it yet. And I don't mean they're immature in a nasty sort of way. They've just not organized themselves yet to really tackle these issues. For many places, the parts of the world where the fossil fuel industry is one of the most dominant suppliers of jobs, and for them to change to natural sources of energy is going to take a long time, 10s, 20s of years. And I understand that economic impact, but there has to be a debate about it. And I think as place branders, we're not going to affect the technologies of reducing emission. We're not engineers. We have to raise with both our clients, the political masters, and the stakeholders of the place, the issues around about this. We have to provide them with the information. Education is often used as the word, educate them about it. And some people find that very aggressive language. Not enough people, I've found, know enough about the climate crisis. The knowledge is partial. I've immersed myself in it for about 3 or 4 years now. And I begin to understand why they don't know about it. It's not debated enough. It's not in the media enough. Yes, it's in the media. Climate emergency groups are in the media. But at the local level, in terms of informing policy, I can name a small number of places in the UK like Exeter or Bristol where the mayors or leaders of the council have really taken this seriously. 2 or 3 out of 400 plus local authorities is not going to dent this. This is a slow process, but we can become advocates for it. We can become emissaries for really taking this seriously. And if we don't, then we will be promoting places whose assets and attractions are going to be, in the longer term, badly affected by the impacts of the climate emergency, mainly because they took no mitigating actions.
That would really be a pity for the people who live there and whose livelihoods depend on it. So our time is almost up, but before I let you go, Malcolm, you already mentioned Costa Rica as one example. Are there any other practical examples of cities or countries that you know of which are already integrating climate issues in their branding?
I think the straight answer to that is there are very few who have reached the point of integrating the action in their branding. I refer again to Costa Rica, where they are, if you like, making a virtue of the fact that they have organized their government to deal in a very high level of impact way with the reduction in carbon emissions and a move to green energy. And they are promoting that as an asset, as an advantage of their country, as a place to locate. They're promoting it to their indigenous populations, the people who live and work there, as a way in which they are securing their health future, their economic future, their social future. In the UK, I know of the examples of the Mayor of Bristol, who has introduced policies to deal with these issues and act in a more coordinated way. And most recently, I came across the example of the leader of the City of Exeter Council down in the West Country. And they're doing the same. Neither has yet kind of twigged, if I could put it that way, to the advantages of using this awareness of the action they've got to take place as part of their brand campaign to sell the advantages and the locational advantages of their cities. But I think that will come.
Yeah.
What about
the Nordics?
I think, I mean, I worked for a long time over the last 2 years in Stockholm, and that was really on the tourism brand and attracting it. And I would say, I mean, Stockholm is a new brand strategy to be the most creative city, not just in the Nordic area, but in the world. And part of that creativity is their innovations in environment, their innovations in district heating systems, their innovations in encouraging firms to adopt clean energy. That's not yet reached, if you like, a main thread of the brand strategy. When you hear about the brand strategy for Stockholm, it's about the creative city. I think within a small number of years, it will be the creative city that is seen as leading the charge on minimizing the impacts of climate change and using creativity as a key platform for their resilience. These things take time. And I think part of the reason is because it takes time for this to percolate through, that this activity, which many politicians just see as, oh, it's marketing, it's about promoting our good assets. It's not. Too many politicians don't recognize the value of promoting the fact that they are dealing with these difficulties. It's much easier to promote the fact that you've got great culture heritage, a great opera house, whatever, and not kind of promote the fact that you're actually retooling and making 600,000 houses in East London much more resilient, not polluting, moving to clean energy. So we need to bring the amelioration, the mitigation up to par and sit alongside promoting all the great things they're doing and make them recognize or help them recognize that the mitigation activity ensures more of a future for the great things they're currently proud of. Because if they don't have the mitigation, the great things are going to decline.
So imagine an organization like Barcelona Activa or Copenhagen Capacity ask you for 3 things their place brand organization could do for being well prepared for the climate emergency. What would you tell them?
I think the first thing they need to do is very simple. Audit the potential impact of what they know about the climate emergency on their current offer, and that will identify for them where they have to take action to protect their brand assets. I think they've got to assess the scale, nature, and cost of mitigation and divert resources to that. Thirdly, I think then they need to take prioritized action. It's a bit like saying, well, where will mitigation have the most positive effect on the audiences we want to keep and attract? But I think the fourth is then recognizing they have to put the value of taking mitigation action right at the center of their government programs, policies, and investments. And finally, I'd suggest to them, follow the example of the places which have set up citizens' assemblies to discuss the impacts of climate change on communities. Hear from, people talk about ordinary people. We're all ordinary people, for God's sake. We need to create structures in which ordinary people take part in these debates and not just leave it to those who are elected with selective interests and poor memory recall to undertake that. So those would be my five key points of action.
My key takeaways from the conversation with Malcolm are that addressing the climate emergency might not be the main focus of place branders, and that their ability to do something about it can appear to be limited, for example by whoever is in charge at a political level. At the same time, place branders have a responsibility to serve the communities they work with, and examples like Costa Rica show that it is indeed possible to smartly build a country's brand positioning around topics of sustainability and climate change. There is great but currently unrealized potential for place branding strategies to take a lead in making countries and cities more environmentally sustainable. The main challenge is to reformulate the agenda of place branding in a way which supports resilience and sustainability, especially as we now face the climate emergency. Climate change issues must be addressed in place brand strategies, and this is rarely the case. Place brand strategies should possibly have less of a focus on economic growth and instead focus more on issues of resilience and sustainability. Some of the experts whom we interviewed for this white paper are skeptical about how much of an impact place branding initiatives can have on the climate crisis. on a global scale, advocating instead to focus on initiatives which benefit the resilience of specific locations. And clearly, local initiatives matter. At the same time, though, since place branding is all about strategic, long-term visioning, it does have the potential and symbolic power to educate, to inspire, and to foster cooperation among a place's stakeholders and community, but also across borders. And that's exactly what we need. Thank you for listening to Place Brand Leaders, the podcast of the Place Brand Observer. I'm Florian Kaefer, and I hope you enjoyed this episode with Malcolm. Got feedback? I'd love to hear from you. Connect with me on LinkedIn, Twitter, or by sending me a message through the placebrandobserver.com website. Join me again next time when we take you to Costa Rica and hear from the country's chief place brander how his team has managed to unite stakeholders around actively promoting sustainability and climate resilience. You'd like to get the most of the Place Brand Observer? Join our premium program for full access to all stories on placebrandobserver.com and much more.